yeah, I'm Neave O'Clery. I'm based at the Centre for Advanced Spatial Analysis at UCL, where I'm an associate professor and also a Turing fellow. So I'm actually not going to talk about a research project today. So as part of a grant that was actually funded by the Urban Analytics program of the Turing, we proposed to do a bit of a scoping report, right? To look into a little bit the literature on green transformation at the city level. So when I talk about green transformation, here I'm talking about economic transformation, or more specifically structural transformation. How does an economy move into more green jobs, more green products, and the creation of new green technologies? Right, okay, so what's the policy context? So we know that the UK government has committed to so-called net zero by 2050, and there's a lot of questions around how we get there. So what has been quite interesting in recent years is that there's been a real push by city leaders in the UK to drive this sort of new green agenda. And so, various cities have declared a so-called climate emergency and have developed quite detailed localized plans for their local economy. But many of these plans focus on very specific sectors. So things like energy, transport. Quite a few cities are focusing on retrofitting and trying to make homes more energy efficient. But there's a need to kind of understand more broadly how to transform the industrial structure over the next decade or so. Okay, but this is a sort of very broad, large question. And when we break it down, there are some significant challenges, even when we try to define what is a green product, what is a green job, what's a green technology. These are actually non-trivial things to define. And so first of all, we can think about products, right? So we can think about, it's quite easy potentially to measure, say, emissions from the production process, but typically many definitions neglect the energy required, neglect the emissions that come from energy that's used in those processes, and then of course, emissions or impacts that come from supply chain components, right? And so it's potentially quite some potential for data science there to get a better grasp on these sort of like second and third tier components of green impacts from the production of products. And then of course, even more complicated, what's a green job, right? So you could say, well, a green job is a job that produces a green product, but then there are lots of green jobs that don't produce green products, right? You can think about somebody who's involved in recycling, for example. And then of course, you could imagine the production of a green product like solar cells. Like there's some very technical people involved who are very green in a sense, right? They have very specific green tasks. And then there's some very general people involved, administrative staff, project managers, which arguably are not quite so green, they're not quite so specific. And so there's been a big push in the US recently to try to define what's a green task, a green skill, a green occupation in much more detail. And then finally, a green technology. Well, typically, technologies are measured by patents, right? And so a patent is actually assigned a technology class by a patent office. And so it's really quite manual again. Patent offices are inherently then deciding what is green through their assignment of technology classes. So this is very much an open question about how to decide what is green. Okay, so there's a couple of preliminary results on sort of green structural transition that I'm just going to show you very briefly. So we know that green products tend to be more complex, more sophisticated, and that wealthy countries tend to produce these complex green products. In terms of moving into more green products or more green jobs, when you think about urban economies, you often think about diversity and variety of the activities in the city. Well, it turns out that these exact same things are important for moving into new green activities. So, for example, countries that have a higher level of industrial variety or diversity tend to increase the number of green jobs faster over time. And regions that have a bigger diversity of technologies, so they're patenting many, many different more technology classes, are much more likely to go into more mature green technologies. So these are the types of cities and regions that tend to produce breakthrough green technologies. And then there's an element of path dependence as well, though, not just diversity. So we know that in general, in this sort of green, in this kind of industrial transition literature, we know in general that cities and regions, they tend to move into new activities that are similar to what was there before. And this is also true for green activities, right? So we know that countries that already produce complex green projects tend to produce more of them in the future. That's not too surprising. And more generally, green patents also tend to appear in cities and regions in which there was already, pre-existing knowledge in similar technologies in the past. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up here about thinking a little bit about what are the opportunities for data science or, general regional studies or urban studies to contribute to some of these questions. I think our overarching impression when we were carrying out this scoping report is that there's actually remarkably little in this field already, but it's also quite difficult to maybe nail down exactly on a sort of more micro scale, what are the key interesting questions. So I think one thing that we thought that came out of this, that there's definitely scope for better definitions of greenness that take into account much more the sort of interconnectivity of production, for example. So supply chain analysis, so using things like firm level input-output networks is definitely an avenue for exploitation. I'm not suggesting there hasn't been anything done before, but we think that there's quite a lot of potential for a lot more work in that area. And similarly, text analysis, right? So you could see yourself doing some kind of NLP on sort of green activities to try to classify them better. There's also quite a lot about, how do green technologies emerge, and how do green capabilities interact with non-green capabilities. So there's potential for sort of firm and worker level analysis of that type of thing. You might think, okay, well, how does AI fit into this? Is AI increasingly involved in the emergence of green capabilities and green technologies, or are we really dependent on human capital at this stage? Has there been an impact on COVID on any of this development? Obviously green transition took a bit of a backseat there for a while, and it would definitely be interesting to think about whether that has had an impact on the sort of rate of transition into new green activities. So there's a big literature. I don't know if any of you worked with patent data before. There's a big literature on what drives the emergence of so-called breakthrough innovations. It certainly would be interesting to look at, how green breakthrough innovations fit within that general landscape, whether they are fundamentally similar to the type, whether what determines them is fundamentally similar to, what we already know about general breakthrough innovations, or there's something different. And that's something that I don't think has been explored before now. And then, of course, there are questions about, the environment is very different in cities compared to historical industrial regions or peripheral regions. So, what's the opportunity or potential for these regions to become involved in this green transition? Arguably, they are home to some of the so-called dirty industries, so would be potentially, wanting to engage in a green industrial transition, but actually, given what we know about what is a driver of such transitions, that actually might be more difficult for that type of region. And then linked to that, what enables a city or region to leapfrog, right, to move significantly beyond what they've done before into very different activities. And that's a very active area of research at the moment, this idea that, cities and regions can actually break free from path dependence and develop completely new competencies, which is rarely seen, but does happen. Okay, so I hope that that's provided some food for thought.